Basic tree pruning is going to focus on the 4 Ds: dead, diseased, dying, and defective branches. We want to target these first before we do anything else to trees. We might also want to look for some things like codominant stems, which would be a sort of defective branch. And we want to look for things like clearance issues if we want to be able to walk underneath trees, maybe mow grass underneath them, things like that. And if we want to limb up young trees, that's another thing where we might just want to focus on reducing some of those branches rather than removing them outright, because they do help increase the girth of the main trunk. So why don't we go look at some examples of these things?
Okay, so what is a defective branch?
Well, a defective branch could be any number of things, but here we have 2 good examples on one branch of defects. So here we have 2 branches that are touching each other very closely. This can pose a problem because over the years the rubbing action of these can cause damage to the cambium tissue of the plant and provide a place for infectious diseases and pests to enter. Another example of a defect, here we can see some exposed inner tissue where a branch was probably broken off here before. This would be considered defective too, and again, this might be a good candidate for removal. Another example of a defect can be what we call codominant stems. If you see these 2 large branches forking here, they're both kind of fighting to be the central leader of this tree. And because of that tight angle they form, you can see some of that discoloration between them. That's what we call included bark. There's a greater likelihood that one of those branches is going to break off in a storm. So this is another candidate to be removed over the course of time. So another one of the 4 Ds we want to look for are diseased branches. We can see this dark discoloration on this locust branch, indicating that it probably has some sort of infection. So this again is a good candidate for removal. One of the other 4 Ds, and probably the easiest to find, is just dead branches. Especially in the summertime, if there are no leaves on it, it's probably dead. In the wintertime, check for buds. If it doesn't have any buds, or if the buds on it seem dried out and fall off easily when you touch them, chances are that branch is dead. Or if you give it just a little flex test and it snaps easily, again, it's probably dead and a definite candidate for removal. Sometimes with diseases, defects, or damage, we might want to retain the branch for a certain period of time. There's never any reason to retain a dead branch, and it can be removed at any time of the year. So next we're going to talk about cutting back branches.
So which branch should we cut back? How do you know? And how far should you cut it back to?
How far depends kind of on what you're trying to achieve. Maybe you're trying to shorten a branch that's growing towards your house. Maybe you're trying to cut a branch that's providing a clearance issue that you can't walk under. But regardless of how you're doing it, you're going to follow the same basic principles. So one thing, you always want to cut back to a node. A node is where growth emerges from the main stem. So for example, if I want to shorten this branch, I'd want to cut it right back to here, right in front of a node. If I were to cut it right here, I'm going to leave a dead stub of wood. This is going to become a point for infection and for insects to start feeding. Another principle we need to follow is the 1/3 rule. So we always want to cut back to a branch that's at least 1/3 the diameter of the parent stem. So for example, if I were to cut back to here, this isn't really 1/3 of the main stem. It's more like 25% of it or even less. So I wouldn't want to cut back there because the tendency is going to be for this branch to just die. So instead, I'm going to find a parent stem that has that 1:3 ratio and cut it back to there. And then this branch will be able to take over. This wound will heal over, and the tree should continue to be healthy.
So what if we're removing a whole branch from its main trunk?
Well, if we're removing it from the main trunk, what we need to remember is that we need to make our final cut at the branch collar. On a hackberry or sugarberry, as we're looking at here, the branch collar is easy to see. If you see these bands of tissue forming around the main stem, those are going to show the boundary of the branch collar. This is where the main tissue of the trunk and the tissue of the branches actually meet and separate. And we want to make our cut just outside of that branch collar. So we don't want to just go and cut this branch off at the branch collar because the weight of the branch itself can have a tendency to break and rip and do some damage to the main stem. So what we want to do is take the weight off of the branch and then remove it back to the main stem. Now I don't actually want to remove this branch, but I do have another branch over here I'm going to remove. So the first step I'm going to take in what I call the 3-cut method is to make an undercut. So you just cut a little ways into the bottom of the branch. Not so far that your saw gets pinched, but just enough to break through the cambium layer there and some of the tissue at the bottom of the tree. Now I'm going to make a second cut just outside and above that one. And you see how it neatly breaks away without tearing this bark back. Now that I have the weight off of this branch, I can come back, line my saw up with the branch collar, and make my final cut. Now I have a nice clean cut, and that's going to seal over well. So here we have an example of a really nice cut that was made several years ago. It's almost completely sealed over. We just have this tiny little hole left in the middle where that tissue hasn't completely closed over. If we make a nice cut and preserve that branch collar, this reaction wood's going to totally seal over. The wood inside is going to be protected from insects and diseases.